thank you so much for joining me today. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Let me start at the beginning. How would you describe yourself as a man of many talents and myriad of job titles, and who are you?
I guess, first of all, I'm an Australian. I'm a technology and policy professional. I'm an author and I'm a consultant. But what I really bring to discussions about technologies today and the exciting world of what's happening and what might come is a set of ways to understand the opportunities, the strategies and the human impact of technologies. And that's where I spend most of my time.
And briefly, how did you get into it?
So I'm a lawyer by training, and I started my career working in economic consulting, assessing national policies and what they implied for investment. And then about 13 years ago now, I joined the World Economic Forum, my former employer, and I had this amazing run with the forum, looking first at strategic foresight scenarios, so really looking at the impact of technology and politics and environment on lots of different sectors and countries. I became head of Europe for the forum, so I then looked at innovation policy across the EU bloc and worked very closely with Germany and France, UK and Italy. And then the last 4 years I've been working as, I guess, an architect of this concept of the fourth industrial revolution. So working with Professor Klaus Schwab, my former boss, on his book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, 2015, and then co-authoring a more recent publication called Shaping the Future of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And so it's been one of those serendipitous career paths, but always guided by this idea that I'm interested in this connection between what's happening at the big level, kind of system change, technology, these big things, but making it really, really relevant to organisations and the decisions that you and I have to make today.
So I think, kind of from my perspective, starting place is you've worked in policy, I suppose, and kind of looking inward at something, and now you're actually saying, okay, how can we implement that? Where do you think, is there a disconnect between policymakers and strategic thinkers and actually people who are on the coalface who are actually experiencing technology and how it impacts them?
I think there are lots of really important and challenging divides across this group of people that now today are meant to help make policy, not all of whom are in government. There's a recent survey of about 450 technology-related regulations across the world, and about 23-24% of them actually came out of the private sector, the initial proposals and work. So it's not all purely government regulation. There's a lot more governance, where today's corporate policies of a large tech company are actually way more powerful than any single state's policies. So I guess the divides are, first of all, I see quite a big divide between the realities of someone that works in government and has to write a set of rules that is politically acceptable and implementable across a very diverse set of stakeholders in their jurisdiction, and then the engineers who are often, on the tech side, the engineers who are maybe in the standards committees or who are running the companies who have to implement or take responsibility for that policy. They're saying, no, I want an exact answer. I want clear guidelines. And the language, the background, the way of looking at the world is completely different. The set of pressures on them is different.
Yes.
And I think that policymakers are incredibly strategic, but they're strategic in their area of policy making and the political and process elements of that. Whereas the big picture aspects of, say, the social impact, the business impact, it's not as immediately relevant to them. And when technologies are changing quickly, it's hard to know what might happen. So it's not an easy task. But certainly that divide is something that we need to be better at.
And did you have to change your kind of, as you moved out on the kind of economic forum and more kind of into the substance, I suppose? Did you have to change your thinking and how you?
I think, yeah. So I mean, the path that I've taken, as you mentioned, is spending a lot of time at the 30,000 foot level and working closely with CEOs and senior ministers and policymakers, but doing so maybe for a week at a time or over the course of a white paper and research. And one of the fantastic opportunities of that is you just get to see so many different examples at the high level, and you understand the landscape, you understand where there are challenges and opportunities. what you don't get to do as much is to really accompany them and be part of that journey over time. So what I'm really excited and privileged now to have the opportunity to do is to be part of that within organisations and actually follow how they're implementing and what's going right, what's going wrong. Really hear the stories and the concerns that they can't express publicly, which are critically important to understanding how we make better policy, but not just how we make better policy, how we make better businesses, how we make better technology products, how we live together as increasingly technological beings, like how we do that individually. So that's been fascinating. I think the mindset shift from me was dealing with the politics and complexity within these organisations is as always as much of an issue as it is across and between them. So understanding that it's very interesting to sit in a board meeting and as an expert be asked a series of questions about technology and the future of technology and have the chief technology officer in the organisation completely silent for the entire board meeting and have no one else on the board ask the chief technology officer what she or he thought.
Yes.
And for me that's quite interesting and confronting in thinking, well, who in your organisation is that strategic thinker and are you giving enough time to the professionals that you've hired who do probably know much more about this than the average executive. So those kind of dynamics, very interesting and have challenged some of my preconceptions.
So I find that, a couple of things I find fascinating about that kind of, so do you feel that because you're coming in from outside the company, they automatically defer to you as opposed to the CTO of that?
I think it's always the case. There's a couple of things at play. Like if you've got me or anyone else coming in for an hour, 2 hours, half a day, you do want to kind of monopolise their time when you've got the CTO there, perhaps more on tap. So I understand that sometimes they will take that perspective. One of the values that I bring is stories and examples from other organisations, from other companies, other governments, other NGO contexts, and so that's often stuff they wouldn't have heard. It's new or it's challenging information. So again, that's different. But when it does come down to having the conversation about the strategy and implementation at the organisational level, I do feel that chief technology officers are being underutilised in that. And that's what I see in those board conversations. I also see, like everywhere, just a huge variety of levels of understanding and misconception around these different technologies, which is natural because we're at the early stage for a lot of it, and the details change.
So do you think your role is to go in and ask them the right questions, or do you think your role is to guide them down the right path?
I think the right path is one that is guided by the right questions. Okay. So I push back very clearly against this idea that there is one path, one future that you can know that you should go down as an organisation. I focus a lot more about investing in tools and systems which are able to be flexible and adaptive as the technology landscape changes, as the competitive landscape changes, as policy or political considerations change, which is very important in the regulatory space, very important if you're developing a new product in the market or looking to enter a different country or different sector for your goods and services. So understanding options, I do a lot of scenario thinking, scenario planning in the strategic and implementation side of things. And also encouraging a mindset which doesn't assume that one person in the organisation has to have those answers or one group is to develop that.
And do you think kind of over your time that actually this has been a seismic change for boards and people at the top of organisations, and how well do you think they're coping with that?
Oh, absolutely. Look, the boards are really, I think, the boards that I've been working with struggle with prioritising so many different issues at the moment that are not within their traditional set of expertise in governance. And so one of the biggest ones more recently is cybersecurity. And I hold a visiting professor position at UCL in London, and we look a little bit there at the cybersecurity issues and governance. And boards find it hard to think, well, I've got my director's duties over here, I've got my health and safety kind of liabilities over here. Where do I fit cyber? How do I manage this in the portfolio? Who can advise us? How much knowledge do I need? And now we're hitting boards with, okay, you don't just need to worry about cybersecurity, you also now need to worry about machine learning and bias in machine learning in your systems and how you treat workers and employees through AI systems. And suddenly on the back of this, they're saying, well, okay, now where do I fit that in my risk register? So that's challenging. It does mean that there's a heavier reliance on outside counsel and expertise. And I'm a big fan of this idea that most of us will probably have to do about 2 years worth of additional training in the next decade, to come up to speed. That's the rate of skills change that's happening. And directors are no different. So my challenge to directors is to say, try and find a plan for over the next 2 to 3 years to find 6 weeks of professional development on the areas where you think you can add the most value for your board. But 6 weeks, put it in the calendar.
How do they react to that?
Well, they say that's very, very difficult because, I have, if I'm an executive director, I have, I've got to run the part of my business, all the business. And if I'm a non-executive director, I'm on many different, competing issues but nevertheless, all the research on the future of work says that we're expecting frontline staff and people graduating from university today to be able to upskill and reskill over time to adapt to a changing environment. It's probably even more true, frankly, of board members. So being able to work with them, have that mindset shift, point them to resources that are very practical and doable, but get them, in that discussion point of saying, well, what is the minimum viable understanding I need to execute my director's duties in 2020? Right, that's a really important question.
And do you think there are traits, either from companies or individuals, as to who is more likely to be kind of willing to accept that, as opposed to those who kind of hold back and turn around and say, no, I know, and I'm good at that?
I think boards which have greater levels of diversity have greater levels of acceptance of that people don't know everything. Okay. So when I see boards that are have, say, for instance, an energy company that has all engineers, all from the kind of same generation who are experts and they cover, they know what's happening in investment, they know what's happening in the technology, in the market space, etc. As they're all kind of senior, well-seasoned executives who are now at that board level, because they know so much about their industry and their sector, they're less likely to perceive that they are missing part of that picture. Whereas if you have a board that has some younger people, some people in their 40s perhaps, or the late 30s and 40s, when you have people from different geographic regions, etc., who bring different expertise, it's actually easy to have this conversation because the board members realise that, well, I'm not expert in that. That's Jane, or that's Asma. That's expertise in that area. So if I need to really understand what she's bringing to this discussion, then maybe that training makes sense so that I can actually, comprehend and add value to that part of the subcommittee or that part of the dialogue on risk or governance. So I think the benefits of board diversity actually are also in that it enhances the likelihood that you're going to learn.
So let me take you back to something you said earlier, where I think you said 24% of policy is being produced by actually companies themselves rather than through policymakers.
Yep.
What balance are we, without being overly negative, in terms of who runs the world? Is it the companies themselves, or are we still a democratic country where we have our leaders, our political leaders?
Policy is hugely important. So you don't have to look at tech to do this, but you can look at something like, again, energy markets, or you could look at transport. When policymakers in energy change a rule, it reverberates across the entire industry. 70% of the world's energy production is state-controlled, is national oil companies. So there are lots of different sectors where policy matters because they control that policy environment. Transport's an obvious one. We have road rules and regulation and product liability laws around cars, etc. With technology, we've a lot of technologies. We've operated in a space that's been a little bit different. So part of the confrontation, I think, for tech companies is being told, "Gosh, we didn't realise that those we wouldn't like those impacts coming out of the way you're doing social media. Now we need to kind of put some controls in place." And a lot of the companies are answering or saying in response, "Well, we didn't build that in. Secure. We never built user authentication into a base layer of the internet. It was never part of the infrastructure layer of the protocols of the internet when it was created. So to have to add that on top, that's expensive. It goes against our business model. It alienates our users. And so part of the challenge there is to say yes, but we need to solve. It's clear that we need to solve those problems. So how do we work together and make that work?
How cynical are you about the fact that the companies have strategically thought through all these options and they know it? They're just not sharing it until it's highlighted to them. Or do you believe that they're learning as we're going as well?
Well, I do think that there are some cases where, if you're a major tech company today and you go to a country and you say, look, I don't really want to have to do much on data protection and alerting users to data sovereignty and privacy, I think that would be a little bit disingenuous because all the major tech companies have had to come to the party with GDPR. So in a country that doesn't have the same level, they've turned it on for everyone else. They can turn it on for GDPR. They can turn on that same level of provisions for another country. So I think in some cases like that, it's relatively easy. So there's a case for saying the reason they don't is because they don't want to set a precedent. But I'm actually a big believer that the staff, the executive teams running these companies, they do have the best interests of their user base and the populations in mind. It's where I'm a bit cynical and where I find it very challenging also to work alongside these firms is when it actually goes to the very heart of their business model. Right. When it actually challenges advertising revenue or challenges engagement. When your platform makes money or at least loses less money the more people click on the next video, the way you pay your data centers is to make sure that people click on the next video. When we start to understand that clicking on the next video, the algorithms that do that lead people into more and more kind of extremist areas on the internet or thoughts, and that could be challenging for democracy or for mental health, whatever the kind of viewpoint is there. That's when it becomes very challenging to go back to that company and say, you got to stop that. But then their answer would be, well, we can't run the platform because that's the way. And do
you have then any sympathy for the company?
I think so, because think about Uber. I'm from Switzerland. Last month, Geneva decided it would withdraw Uber's license to transport people. Lots of people I know rely on Uber to get their kids to school, to solve last-minute transport issues, etc. It's very convenient. It's relatively low price. And traditionally, the taxi sector in Geneva, it's getting much better. But traditionally, it was you could only get a taxi from a taxi rank. It would take ages to arrive if you called, etc. Not a very efficient system. Uber's shaken that up. I know a lot of people who are quite upset that Uber has suddenly had to, the app doesn't work anymore in Geneva, because they were like, well, now it's just hugely more costly in time, in effort, in thought, in mental load to be able to do what I was able to do for the years that Uber's been operating in that market. So I have quite a lot of sympathy, not just for the tech company, but for the people who rely on those services. What I think we don't do that well is understanding through that process and tracking that social impact and being able to say, well, if that's the situation when we turn off Uber, how do we make sure that we're working with the taxi companies to provide that level of service?
Whose remit would that fall under?
Whose remit?
Who should be doing that?
Well, in that case, it's the canton of Geneva and the city. So most of the things when it comes to taxi services, it is the city. So it's be the city of London for here. I mean, definitely, City of London, Transport for London does a fantastic job of investing in long-term thinking and short-term services for easing congestion and increasing safety and air quality for Londoners, right? Yeah. For the millions and millions of people that live in this city, and deciding what to do with road sharing has a big impact on congestion on the roads, on parking, on safety, on convenience. And so understanding what that impact is really important to making good policy. At the very least, because you know that a lot of Uber passengers are liable to, start writing letters to their MP or to the mayor saying, gosh, don't take this away from me, which will increase the political pressure as well. So I think that's one where we've actually underinvestment in the tech policy space is the positive social impacts as well as some of the negative, and understanding what else we can do to fill those gaps and meet those needs. Because otherwise it becomes very difficult once something exists to suddenly pull it out.
So do you look on that kind of in the sense of the view from the outside of politics and kind of these type of things, it's all in a very negative environment? and it's an avoidance, and it's a kind of, there's a lot of anger, and actually it's never really, and politics has a problem in terms of they need to they need to turn it much more into a positive impact for the individuals and society as a whole.
I think there's a much more nuanced picture here than we mostly created. Like at the moment, we're going through a little bit of a tech backlash, where the big platforms are being portrayed as quite negative in many different ways, and that's a challenge for them. But it's also a challenge for society when we don't recognise how useful how valuable the provision of these services are. Now, some of those you might say, look, to be honest, overall, most of the YouTube consumption is pretty mindless, like distracting stuff. It's not super valuable. Fine, but at the same time, there are tens of millions of people around the world who rely on video platforms for education, for sharing, for self-actualization in different ways. So I think we do tend to go like as with the algorithms, we go into a very black or very white kind of negative or positive view, and we try and make policy stories around those extremes. That's the way you win votes. That's the way you get coalitions of action. I totally understand the realpolitik of it. As hard as it might seem, I do think we need to step back a little bit on this and say, okay, of the big tech platforms that we find confronting because of their market power or because of their influence on democracy, like how do we tease this apart, and let's recognise the great things that they're doing, but also understand that where they're constrained because their investors and their business model is inherently set up in a different direction to what you might think of as a good outcome for society. So those aspects are difficult to talk about in the media. They're difficult to make as a policy pitch in Parliament. But I think it behooves us to be in that space now. And those conversations are happening in the standards community. So in those groups of engineers, the IEEE and others who are making the next set of technical standards, they're doing that compromise, and in fact they're very frustrated because they're going around on those levels. Yeah.
And then how do you feel the users or the consumers, or whatever we want to call them, how aware are they, and how informed are they, and how much do they want to be more informed? Yeah.
I think there's a huge desire to feel empowered by technology today. I think people have appreciated overall aspects of GDPR and data protection, particularly in Europe, because it does mean that if you and I want to know what's happening to our data, you can get it. I think people do feel a bit more protected, and they see the government making moves in this direction. So, they are now more and more important public policy questions for your average citizen. So I do think that there's a desire to be engaged on this. What I think is perhaps more difficult is most of us take a lot of these services and the way we live completely for granted. Yeah. And we're not really aware, I think, as a society or as an individual, how shaky some of this stuff is. So, a lot of the large tech companies have only recently started making profits. So they rely on continued investment, etc. A lot of the big firms that you'll see in the news producing exciting new technologies rely on government subsidies, or have relied on government subsidies, and yet it's a story of kind of market innovation. And Mariana Mazzucato, who works at UCL, is a fantastic professor on this point about the state support for technology is really critically important for innovation. So I think from the perspective of what the public, what we could have as a more public citizen-led conversation is around, how different my life is now compared to 10 years ago or 12 years ago when the iPhone was released and the smartphone invented, and what it would mean to me to lose or gain in that area. That's the kind of conversation that would help policymakers craft better responses and get away from this, I either ban it or I don't do anything. It's a really false choice. Okay. It's not the way to do it. And by the way, the same thing, we're talking a lot about policy, but the same thing is true, and the same set of conversations are really necessary for companies who invest in technology themselves.
And so how do you think that the user can be engaged more?
So I think there's a big push for, at least in the work that I do, for people to have take the conversation about technology very personally, to say it's not the responsibility of someone else to make these tech decisions for me, because actually I'm the one that controls whether or not I look at my iPhone at dinner, or whether I use a particular platform or not, and I can actually understand what that impact is on me and my family as much as anything. So there's the point about someone else has to take responsibility, but there's also the question of, okay, well, what power do I have in this ecosystem? What choices do I have? A classic example of this is search. Google in many markets around the world, Australia, where I'm from, has more than 95% search, probably 97% search. Not exactly sure what the amount is in the UK, but it's over 90%.
I use it.
Yep. And people don't realise that there are other options to use, and this is nothing at all against Google. But if you wanted to use DuckDuckGo, that's a search platform that is very empowering because it doesn't do any tracking, doesn't record, doesn't use your data. It's not, with all due respect for DuckDuckGo, it's not quite as good as Google, but for 80-90% of your search is totally fine. And if at some point you need to flick into Google to find that specific article or thing you need to talk about, that's a way of feeling empowered because you have choice on the platform. We often don't feel we've got choice because everyone's on Facebook, therefore we need to be on Facebook, or those kind of things. So that's one element. I think secondly, we haven't invested as much on the local level, at local town level, on these technology discussions in terms of town halls and engagement about things. I think the more and more we go into aspects like, every town and village in the UK needing really high speed internet, and start to have those discussions, or more public Wi-Fi, etc. I think those kind of local discussions can be really handled by your town, by your village, etc. And I think it's a really useful source of engagement. And then finally, I think that students today coming through are much more aware of these issues than previous generations. A lot of the view from older generations is, kids today will share anything on social media, and there's no concept of privacy. I actually think that's completely wrong. Right. There's actually a much more nuanced and sensible approach to privacy online for most people. It's just that they view their limits in different parts of their life and their identities in different ways than we do, than older generations. And I'm over 40, so I put myself in the ancient category in the tech world. So I think those having those conversations across generations is really, really important.
So my last question, I suppose I've got to ask you this point. So are you positive? Are we going to get through this period of time and come to a place whereby actually technology kind of sits comfortably in society without necessarily kind of imposing, as some people currently view it?
Yeah, I think if you took the view that the past will be like the future will be like the past, I think you'd be quite pessimistic, because we've made already a lot of errors in the digital revolution and the third industrial revolution that what I would, when I and my co-authors call the fourth industrial revolution, need to be solved in order to build the right processes and infrastructure and business models to be all inclusive and prosperous in the fourth industrial revolution. But what I'm excited about is the resonance that this message of we're entering the fourth industrial revolution, we have the power, let's make those decisions together now, that the power that message has and has been received by the audiences and organisations, governments, NGOs, companies that I work with, is evident. And so many people are putting their hands up and saying, no, I want to work on agile governance. I want to work on strategies where we build into our machine learning work inside our firm, anti-bias, anti-discrimination systems. I want to be better informed about the way that technology is affecting our workers. Boards are crying out for support and much more nuanced conversations on this topic. So I'm very hopeful. I'm aware it's a big task, but I think if there's any time that we want to do this, Nick, it's right now.
And on that note, Nick, we should go and get busy doing that. Lovely.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks a lot for your time.
Cheers.